Huge family conversations, another conversation within kind of the emotional leadership. We've talked about a lot of things up to this point, and as we were kind of talking off camera, Mom, it sounds like there's maybe some smaller chunks and segments that you kind of want to take some things in. And so before we kind of dive into that, to kind of recap some of the things that we've talked about. We've kind of laid the foundation for strategic leadership in the home. We first kind of defined what vision architects the future in terms of like how family vision is important and those types of things that families kind of thrive when leaders are intentional in kind of identity, direction, the culture of the home and whatnot, rather than kind of allowing members of the family to drift towards kind of outside influences. Then we kind of, I guess, clarifying that strategic leadership means kind of leading from conviction, not condition. So values stay steady even when life gets stressful, meaning again, having that clarity of focus, of vision, being reiterating things kind of often and regular. From there, we moved into the reality of conviction. Sorry, I'm kind of going through these notes here. That isn't that conviction isn't just enough. That it requires an actual capacity. That somebody actually has to have it within themselves to be able to, if you will, kind of tolerate some of the challenges because um, people believe the right things and yet still fail under pressure if they can't regulate emotions. And so also important, we define emotional maturity, and that's something I know that is going to continue to come up, right? Responsibility under stress, truth telling, boundaries, repair, emotional regulation, which is separate from emotional maturity, which regulation is more about kind of pausing, tolerating, being able to, or tolerating discomfort, returning to baselines. And then that also then leads and ties into emotional intelligence, which is being self-aware, self-management, empathy, being able to repair things that we might have done wrong. And then we also named kind of what happens in family systems when maturity is low. And so weather-driven conditions, emotional contagion, repeated conflict patterns, avoidance, triangulation, story building, repair failure, and how all of those things, well, I guess how positive when we are good at those things, how those affect. And then we also did address a little bit some of those negatives. And I'm sure that's kind of where we're going is more into detail on how emotional maturity, regulation, and intelligence impact family life and whatnot. And I'll, of course, let you kind of talk about that more in a minute. And then we kind of close with strategic response, which is kind of having structure, clarity, boundaries, and then everything, of course, ties back to self-awareness. Um, Being able to know when we're telling ourselves a story and be able to correctly and accurately identify behaviors and patterns in ourselves so that we can then address those things. And so I guess now the next step really is to I guess talk about something I had just briefly addressed is what emotionally mature people do with conflict, and specifically maybe in repairing conflict or kind of the aftermath of conflict in some sense. And so, yeah, I'll let you and clarify anything that I might not have touched on or addressed or said clearly. Please absolutely give me some feedback, and then yeah, tee us off for today's conversation.
Okay, that was great. That's a lot of information, and we've
Yeah.
been building this for a while. And, when you had talked about capacity, really, I believe everybody has a capacity for this emotional intelligence. Um, I think it really centers and kind of, you know, reduces down to skills. It's a skill set. And I think that is the most difficult concept to really um, actualize in your life because everybody believes what they have right now is enough skills. Literally, everyone thinks that.
Sure.
And so I would love for that mindset to become the opposite question and not in the negative, not like, okay, well, what am I lacking? But, ooh, what more could I gain?
Sure.
And so, it's professionals who, are just pure athletes. And you'll see that they end up liking lots of different sports because not because they care if they're perfect at it, they really enjoy the process of learning. Tiger Woods said something in an interview. Why would you hire a different coach and ask them to reteach you golf? And he said, because everyone should go back to being a beginner. And I think, at least for me, I enjoy that process of becoming curious, really curious about relationships and emotions and myself in framework to that, not in a narcissistic way, but more of a what don't I know and how could I improve? And so that kind of starts with where we're at. How do people learn how to do conflict repair? Really understanding what skills they could have to improve on. And so, kind of just moving forward. That, in a nutshell, is emotional maturity. Just you can look at yourself and think, I am absolutely 100% right. And we talked about this a little bit in the last right,
Yeah.
in the last conversation. And you're just like, if if anyone had watched this scenario, they would side with me. And yet your partner feels the exact same way. And
Right.
so it bears the question, how could that happen? And it really is the question, right? How could someone see in real time what just transpired between you and your wife and understand that maybe there's even this other dynamic or a different dynamic, like a fourth realm. And so we have to take what we experience and put it into this very external world and say, what did I observe? How would I describe it? And how do I, or would I repeat it? So that becomes kind of like a science experiment, right? Like that is what happens in a science experiment. They get this data, they conduct a study, and then it becomes legitimized if they can repeat it continually with the same variables happening all at the same time, treating the exact same outcome is the same. And then you can say, all right, it's fact. That's not fiction. Ironically, in relationships, that's impossible. It would never happen. However, there are observable things that we see happen in relationships. And that is that each of us assigns value to an experience based on our beliefs, our fears, our values, and our past experiences. And so, what your wife is bringing to the table is a culmination of that, which is very different than yours. And you bring that. And that's why someone would think, okay, of course, if anyone understood the situation, they would agree with me. And it's true. If someone literally knew that person that well, they might and think you were wrong, and vice versa. And so the most difficult thing we have is that when we're talking about moving into relationships, we have to really care about what was said, if that really does matter. Like I looked at you and said, I hate you. And that may be something that you come back to later and say, no, you literally said, I hate you.
Right.
Well, then what is the shared meaning of the word hate? Right. And maybe I felt it in that moment, but I don't feel it all the time. And those are the big issues that come up in marriage. Right. Because in a moment, I might be feeling hate, but I don't think about you and feel hate. And so, again, what are facts? What are feelings? What is reality? What is the truth of the story that's happening even in real time? And so, the importance of these kind of situations where we're trying to create a family is we want a lot of stability. And we've talked about that in previous sessions where stability, consistency, predictability are really critical um, components to a thriving family. And so we have to start at what we agree as shared reality before we start arguing about, well, I didn't mean the word hate like you think the word hate, because we might have very different ideas. And I can almost guarantee anyone who's in a relationship with someone, if they're doing intimate work like this, they are like, yeah, we had that conversation not too long ago.
Hmm.
I said, you're disrespectful. And she was like, how am I disrespectful? And we get down to the brass tacks, and what she thinks is disrespectful is very different than what you qualify as disrespectful. So we've been arguing for 2 days over very different things, right?
Right.
And it happens all of the time. And so this is why when we start with repair, it comes down to let's figure out exactly what we're talking about if we can get there. So that's where repair starts is fact versus reality versus stories versus experience versus all these other things. So as we've talked about the strategic leadership, the leading by conviction, convictions is values, not convict, not condition, right? Not how I feel after work today. I'm tired, I have a headache. Conviction only works if you have the capacity to carry it, if you have the skill set to be able to say, okay, I've had a really hard day. We need to have this really hard conversation. Or could you give me till the weekend to have this really hard conversation? I don't have the capacity for this right now. That's a legitimate response to something hard and heavy. I'll be honest with you, I can't do this right now. Like for myself personally, if I am sick, that is a horrible time to have a really hard conversation
Right.
that needs repair in it because I am not my authentic self. I'm not bringing a good A game. I am barely surviving, right? Um, that's the most common place that people lose it is at capacity. Because what we start to do, and this is what we're going to kind of talk about, is we start to mind read. We start to think, well, of course they meant that because you said you hated me. So you must mean you hate me. And that person, therefore, fill in the blank of all the negative things I could think about someone who
Right.
hates me. And then you build this thing about them in your mind because they said this one thing. And that becomes the hill you are willing to die on because now you want to prove how you're right. Right. And so that becomes this difficult thing that happens. And it's so important to realize we have to be so mindful of the story building, the mind reading that we do against others, against that for sure we never would say to ourselves, because we would definitely examine our own intent as very, very good and pure, never mean and never unkind. And we would always attribute other people to being mean and evil and trying to hurt me and for sure in the wrong, right? Because that's just, it's so easy to do that
Yeah.
for ourselves. So I feel like there's a lot of emotional maturity. I just want to touch on really fast staying responsible for yourself under stress with truth, accountability, boundaries, repair. Emotional intelligence is self awareness, self management, empathy, and repair. The mind reading is by definition treating your interpretation of someone's behavior as the fact. 100% you know that they meant blank when they said blank. You know it. And the truth of the matter is, you will die in your grave and never know that for sure. Even if they tell you the truth, they could be lying to you, right? You will never 100% know. And then the story building is what is called filling in the missing information with a narrative that favors you and condemns them. That is ultimately what story building in a relationship is. And that could be husband and wife, that could be parent to child, that could be child to parent, that could be siblings, that could be a neighbor, right? You see that often. It could be someone in the church, it could be someone at work. Often our most intimate places are where we story build. And it's partly why we get really curious about someone in kind of a superficial way. And then it's easy and simple to then attribute, well, I don't have to care so much about what my boss thinks because at the end of the day, he's just an alcoholic. Or, wow, I really trust and value that person. because they're a World War II veteran and they swam across shark infested oceans with their buddy on the top. And so, of course, they would tell me the truth. They wouldn't ever. Right. And so we do it both ways. We find heroes and we find villains in story building. And that's why, honestly, reading stories is so fascinating because we love those archetypal um, type characters. And we often like to be the archetypal character, the hero in our own story, never the villain. And so in a relationship, we got to be mindful that that is a default setting that all of us have. And I'm not saying some people don't have a negative perspective of themselves, but that could be a victim. A victim could be part of the story building that you create for yourself. And we see that more and more and more nowadays is victimizing, and pity is something a lot of people want for themselves. Because then ultimately, how does anyone hold them accountable, including themselves, for anything that they do? And so that's really important to be mindful of. Um, so just moving on a little bit. The model of this is fact. What can I observe through words, actions, literal actions, and timing? What is the story I assume to mean? What is the feeling that comes up in my body? What is the need that I have in relation to that? And then ask it. So I had a friend um, in class who made a comment about something I was teaching. And she's someone who I really trust and who comes often and has actually been through the teacher training, but isn't a teacher. And I noticed when she asked me this question, it was just something about one of the exercises. The way she asked it made me feel kind of defensive, like it brought up this trigger in my body. And I was surprised. It, I was surprised by her question. And so I felt my body react. And I realized in that moment with her, I felt kind of disrespected. And it was incongruent enough that I was able to pause and say, did you intend for that to sound this way? And she kind of, again, I saw the same reaction happen in her body, like, oh my gosh, I completely did not mean that to come across that way. I am so sorry. And it was really quick and easy to resolve that.
Right.
And I still don't know exactly what it was about the way she said it and the words she used that created that emotional response in me.
Right.
But I was able to ask the question instead of leaning into this, place of, oh, she must think I'm really bad, or she must think that she could do better, or she's just trying to embarrass me in front of people, or she thinks she could, be such, whatever the story is I might have created.
Right.
But in this last few years for myself personally, I've tried really, really hard to just pause and let the feeling come up in my body and let it happen. And then ask the question, is that how you intended it to sound? Or did you hear what you said?
Right.
Or where am I misunderstanding? Right? Because it happens. People make mistakes. I make mistakes in my communication. I can for sure assume other people make mistakes in their communication. And so it would be, trying to fact find, resisting the story, understanding the feeling, finding the need within yourself of especially just pausing for a second and then asking the question. Um, Other ways that this might show up in life is you text your wife at work She doesn't respond. You get home and you are bugged because you're like, she ignored me. And so she gets home and she's like, hey, what's going on? And you have built up in your mind this whole thing that she's been ignoring you all day long. And really, she just missed your text. Maybe she got 10 texts in a row from
Yeah.
different people, right? And it just got buried. And those are the things you kind of have to realize happen in life, right? And that does take a certain amount of maturity. Someone ignoring me? Is someone just not responding to me? Is someone judging me? Is someone, thinking I did something wrong? Maybe that just didn't come across right. And so it takes maturity to kind of pause and wait and hold your reaction long enough to verify the story. And so this is where, when we come back to repair, this is what repair starts with. It starts with this self-awareness of realizing that we hold double standards. We want everyone to judge us as though they're inside of our heart and mind and know that I was just not feeling well today. And that's why I XYZ. Versus us thinking, well, they're just always selfish people. They just are always inconsiderate. They never consider anyone else. Right. And so we judge others by character traits and we judge ourselves by the kindest way. And
Right.
you might say, well, and honestly, right, like you can interject, like we might say, well, maybe it depends. And that could be true. Because I do think that there are times where we are hard on ourselves, but it's usually after the fact where we have regret, right? Where we think, oh, I didn't handle that properly. But even then, you'll often jump to how the other person lacks a certain character trait that you think you are so abundant in. And that's why it's justified for you to have done that because no one wants to sit with the shame of feeling like they did something wrong. No one wants to sit with difficult feelings for very long at all. And so that comes down in a second. We're going to talk about relief. And that is part of what we want oftentimes is relief from our feelings. And so something that we do is we try to make other people accountable for our feelings. For example, Andrew, when you say stuff like that, it irritates me. So you need to stop saying those kinds of things. And a mature person would say, that's interesting. I didn't realize I choose your feelings for you, or I have that much control over you, or I am so able, right, to influence in such a great way. And ultimately that's the question that it comes down to. How much power and influence are you going to kind of manipulate someone into in order to have relief from any negative feelings you don't want to feel?
Right.
And so that becomes self-protection that we do for ourselves, right? And so you'll see it a lot in little kids. For example, we have so many babies right now in our family,
Yeah.
right? And it would be like, okay, baby, you should stop crying because that makes it so I don't get enough sleep at night and you're being really inconsiderate. Okay.
Right.
It's silly, right? Like that's so silly. But essentially, that's what we kind of hardwire a lot of times our spouse, our children to kind of do,
Right.
right? Like, don't let so and so get upset. They're really, they're really overwhelmed and sad when they're upset. Okay, well, that's their responsibility.
Yep.
And that means then they don't have the capacity for emotional maturity that they need, which is why they should develop more skills and more awareness of how to regulate themselves. That's what those things indicate. And so, a question for everyone to ask themselves: do I give myself context and other people a label? And if so, you need some skill development. Because it's so easy to say, well, that person just irritates me. Well,
Yeah.
what are you then? Well, you're just fill in the blank to them, right? Instead of just going, wow, I need to develop some tolerance when those kind of things happen for me, and I need to figure out like that literal pattern that I just gave you, right? Understand the facts of what's happening. I have someone significant in my life, for example, when there is any amount of tension, their anxiety goes through the roof and they start spinning, and you can see it. It is an actual spin. It can be something so small, like driving to an event. They have to get there 20 minutes early because they're worried about not getting there on time. And once they get there 20 minutes early, then they're annoyed that they're there 20 minutes early and there's nothing to do and we're just supposed to sit here. And then they're sitting there and they're annoyed that people aren't dressed appropriately, or people, where do you get food? Or, right, like, how are we going to get out? The event hasn't even started and we're already worried about when we leave. And so now we have to leave 30 minutes before the event even finishes. We're so overwhelmed by traffic. And the whole experience is about this story that is created and the feelings of trying to find relief. Ruins it. It ruins the experiences. And that person does that. Everyone around them tries to manage all of those things. And so what happens is eventually you just stop going around those people, right? Because they take up and fill up so much of the positive energy with negative things. And so then the confusion is, why am I alone? And so if you're someone who finds yourself in that position often, it's you. Arrows are pointing in, right? And you're not having enough capacity to manage the emotional, difficult things in your life. And you've got to develop skill sets. So, first of all, understand you're telling yourself a story. Second of all, understand it's really easy to blame other people and then give yourself a lot of credit. Um, I included this week a scripture. I don't know if you have it. It's
Yeah,
Doctrine and Covenants 121, verse 41.
sure. Yeah, I can read that.
Okay.
No power or influence can or ought to be maintained by virtue of the priesthood, only by persuasion, by long suffering, by gentleness and meekness, and by love unfeigned. The Lord teaches that real influence isn't maintained by force, it's maintained by regulated, mature behavior, persuasion, long suffering, gentleness, meekness, and love unfeigned.
And so we often, right, attribute those to personality traits. They're really regulation skills. And you either learn them or you don't. And so for me, when we talk about scriptures, ways that we can use scriptures and counsel from the Lord to improve our character, to improve our lives, to improve our status of living, that those are really great places to start. How much better would all of us be if we were a little bit longer in suffering? Because man, people annoy me, right?
Sure.
How much better could I be if I could be a little more persuasive versus either being silent, avoidant, or forceful, right? And so, and I'm not saying I don't know what the range is on this generally. I think it's pretty infinite. I don't I don't know many people that reach the end of being gentle, right? And again, we would have to say, okay, what does gentle mean? And that would be something maybe as a husband and wife, you guys have a disagreement on. You might look at your wife and be like, you're not very gentle. And she'll be like, well, you're not very meek. So, again, these are things we could fight about, right? But we
Right.
have to look at them and go, these are regulation skills for myself, not for someone to use as a label towards me, against me. These are things I should have a desire to internalize and incorporate into my character and my personality and my regulation skills, my emotional capacity. Um, President Hinckley taught something. He wrote a lot about anger, and I have a long history with anger, and we've talked about that a little bit. And a lot of his stuff kind of has similar meaning when it comes to emotional and psychological application. And one of the things he says, so many of us make a great fuss of matters of small consequence. We are so easily offended. Happy is the man who can brush aside the offending remarks of another and go on his way. And I would say, so happy is the man who can brush aside anything that's offensive, whether that's a child, right? People who are raising teenagers, people who are often, if you look at someone who's just had a baby, they're sleep deprived, they're tired, they really need care versus criticism. It's also the reverse of that, right? Like you've just had a baby, or you've just gotten married, or you've just had a difficult life event. Um, Maybe you weren't at your best self for the last month, 2 years. And so maybe the people aren't against you. Maybe everyone really is for you. But it's hard to reason through them because these life events are so heavy. And they literally change you. I just sent my daughter and daughters-in-law this Instagram thing that talked about all of the different things that had to happen in their brain to become a mom. And it's incredible. You literally become a different person once you have a child. You are never the same. I think it's a little different for men, right? I mean, you obviously are become a father. It's just so different for mothers because we're wired to care for those tiny humans in such a different way. Um, I know for myself, when I'm struggling, I'm flooded, right? My brain really wants release. And so, the thing that I have had to learn is that in my life, the place that I'm trying to be right now, especially in more of a matriarch kind of leadership role, it requires a lot of restraint. I have to resist being led by emotion because I get my feelings hurt too. I am not I am not armored. Things penetrate and I can lose clarity just as easy as anyone else. Um, and when I do, everyone feels it. And so to to be mindful of when, when we're not at our best, to have the self-awareness to take accountability, to have the self-awareness to get the needs met that we need. Maybe you're tired, maybe you need a break, maybe you need some fresh air. Like those are all ways we can start to repair ourselves in preparation for some of these different conversations we're going to have the next few times about. So right now we're starting with getting the capacity ready to go in and heal. And everyone wants to start, well, here are the ways that you start repairing. It doesn't start until you have the capacity to do that. It can't because there's no room, there's no space for it. You have to kind of clear out some of the junk internally.
And so I guess before I and there's a handful of things kind of before we close, but I guess if you could rephrase maybe the skills that you're looking to clearly identify, because I mean we've talked, I think, kind of maybe in passing about a few different things, but I've kind of, as I've caught them, I think one, the skills that you're referring to, I think part of it is being self-aware is a skill, right? Being able to ask questions is a skill. Being able to or recognizing or being intentional about recognizing when feelings arise inside of ourselves, to the recognition of that is a skill. Um, I guess also recognition of storytelling in different things, not telling ourselves stories, or I guess being accurate about the things that we're discussing. I guess would you, is there anything I'm missing, or are there things that maybe you want to clarify in terms of the skills to expand or clear out, as you said, the capacity to then be able to have the room to fill with the reparation. But what are those skills that will help us actually do the clearing out? Maybe I haven't been
We
terribly.
haven't gotten to many of them.
Okay.
Right now,
Okay.
we're starting at zero, and it's getting into one and two, which is it starts with us, right? First of all, the number one problem I think all of us have is that we see the person we're dealing with as other. We
Yeah.
see them as different and not like me. And that's where the story comes in.
Okay.
And so that's where we start, right? I have to look at you and go, okay, why would Andrew ever say that to me? How dare he? Right? That's the beginning of the story.
Right. So then I guess that is then the next thing is what is the way to tell that we're telling stories? I mean, how do we recognize, how do we catch ourselves in that storytelling mode
Mhm.
and whatnot?
I think you pause, right? As soon as the feelings come up in your body, that's the first indication. Because usually there's an emotion tied to it. And the emotion that surfaces often has a need that's unmet, right? So anger has a need. It needs to set a boundary. It needs something to stop, right? And usually anger is a pretty solid indicator. Another emotion that might come up is this sense of shutting down. Like, oh, I'm going to be quiet because I don't feel safe. And so I would rather be silent versus saying or doing something that I shouldn't. And sometimes that's okay. Other times that could be a problem, right? Because silence often comes across as agreement. And so we have to clarify what is happening. We have to go, wait a second, what is happening right now? Oh, well, I disagree with what's happening, or I don't like what's being said, or I'm in too big of a group. This is going to feel very targeted if I say something. And so it's better to just hold back, right? And so sometimes what happens is people lean in and turn that into an escalating conflict. And I have definitely been guilty of that as well. I've been guilty of all of these things. And so, how important is the relationship? Pretty important, at least for me, the people that I interact with. And so, it's better to just pause, right? You go into this going, I know that there's a story that I'm going to start creating for myself to protect myself. I need to pause, I need to clarify, and then choose what I'm going to do. And then I have to live with that. And
Yeah.
sometimes it's like, well, maybe I don't necessarily agree with what's going on, but this isn't the time or place to discuss that. I would be happy to have a conversation with that about that with you later, Andrew. That's it.
Yeah.
Right. But then it might be like, right. But now you might feel offended in that moment. And you might want to lean into that because that might feel like shame to you.
Right.
It could, right? And so that's where we just have to de-escalate everything. And so that's unfortunately that's where you start to see emotional maturity,
Yeah.
right? Because there's enough innuendo, inflection in that where you're starting to go, oh, but nobody likes those feelings.
Right.
Nobody.
And so I guess kind of in continuing with that is then how do you not or how do you balance having empathy for people, right? Because instead of telling a story, right, you say, okay, well, I'm not going to tell a story, but I want to have a little bit of empathy. Maybe they're coming from a different place, but yet also not being naive and still kind of accepting or trying to see reality because maybe there is a track record. Maybe there is hurt there before, and you don't want to fall into similar behaviors, but yet you do need to still pause and not let the emotion come over you. How do you balance or maybe address the other side of not letting your emotion so overcome you and being too empathetic with where the other person is?
I think that is a really hard place that we're in the world that we live in today, right? Like this week in Come Follow Me, there was the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. And I think a lot of people in the church wanted to kind of tippy toe around that issue of LGBTQ plus and all of those things because it's delicate. All of us know someone who's gay, and I don't know anyone who wants to be mean to anyone who lives with that in their life. Um, and yet it's contrary to the doctrine of our Savior and Heavenly Father that we believe marriage is between a man and a woman. So those are delicate conversations, right? And that's often what happens is there's I do have empathy in the sense that those are hard topics. I do not feel captured by the need to make someone feel better about having made that decision. I can say, yeah, I can see how you've chosen this lifestyle and I don't need to pound down my ideology into them and force them to admit that it's, in my opinion, goes against the doctrine of Christ, right? Like I don't need to do that. That isn't something that I feel is my job or my right. Um, they get to choose how to live their life and they're responsible for that. And so there's a certain amount of naivete we've got to be really, really concerned for. And also standing for truth and having boundaries, right? Like I don't want those things taught to my children in school. I don't want really anything taught to my children in school that goes against my values. And yet we realize that to a certain level that kids are going to be potentially exposed to things that a parent disagrees with. Like you might have a parent who's a vegetarian who doesn't want their children having meat at lunch. Okay, and if someone brings a string cheese for a school snack, that might ideologically be against some belief that they have, right? And so there's this line that we walk where we stay mature by being open and curious and anchored in principles and values. And we ask questions and we teach our children how to have wisdom through their curiosity and to put some pressure for clarity. Um, and then look for congruency in the way that people follow through on these beliefs. I met someone a couple weekends ago who she was emphatic. She was a vegetarian. That's why this is kind of on my mind. I thought about it and kind of giggled to myself a few times since. And then her husband gave her a bite during their dinner and it had meat, and she said it was really good.
Hmm.
And I just kind of had to laugh to myself because I don't know that she realized it was lamb pate. And
Lamb is
liked it.
lamb.
Just had to kind of, I just, again, so then your question would be, all right, why didn't you say anything? Because I didn't really care, right? But when we're talking about a husband and a wife, and we're talking about parent to child, your children are going to do things you don't agree with and that you don't like, and chances are your spouse will also. You have to be careful being honest and saying the truth as far as you understand it without being gullible. Sister Hinckley, I probably said this on air before. One of my favorite quotes from her is, wives, follow your husbands, but don't follow him off the cliff. And I think it's a really great quote for women in today's world, right? Like I completely believe in this eternal principle of submission, that there has to be an order to things, and women and men really need to work together. Don't be naive, and don't let empathy or sympathy outweigh the truth of what is right and honest. And those are the things I would say about your question, right? The balance literally is what it is. And God shows us in his infinite wisdom that justice is balanced with mercy. I, however, am not qualified to do that well yet. I'm working on it, right? And so I tend to err on the side of pausing and trying to realize that, man, I sure need a lot of mercy and forgiveness in my life. And maybe it would be to my benefit to not be so harsh and judgmental, even though that's easy sometimes, right? Because that gives me relief from my feelings of confusion and incongruence.
And I
So
think that kind of ties into, I guess, the last thought here is when it comes to mind reading, you brought this idea up earlier. What's, I guess, the best thing to do instead of trying to do that, instead of trying to be certain about what we think other people are thinking and feeling and why they're doing it. You had mentioned, pausing and not being so critical and whatnot. I guess what's the simplest kind of behavior instead of mind reading? What could we do instead of that?
ask, right? What did you mean by that? Here's what I heard. What did you intend? The problem is you might not believe them. That's you have to at some point accept the truth of what they're saying, but realize when people are caught in a situation where maybe what they said isn't kind, or and not nice but kind, right, or loving and charitable, they might lie their way out of it because they want relief from those feelings as well. And so you have to understand not everyone has the maturity and the skill that you're requiring from them at the time that you're requiring it. And so there's a lot of patience that is necessary in intimate relationships, a lot of patience. And I need that just as much as anyone needs it in whoever deals with me, right? And so I think the most valuable thing we can do in the sense of maturity is to pause. I think the pause is critical. Things change a lot when feelings have time to kind of dissipate. And so, um, if you if you find yourself wanting to dig in your heels and die on that hill, maybe you need to give it a little minute, or 10 or 50,
Yeah.
right? Maybe. And maybe you just need to pin it for a second and get clear with yourself. And that isn't what I'm not advocating for, is then to keep building your case. Jordan Peterson said something that I really love, and I heard it several years ago. He said, you know, for men, if you spend all of your time, and I think this goes both ways. I do not relegate this to men only. This 100% applies to women. Men, if you spend all of your time building your case, trying to prove that your wife is wrong and that you're right, guess what? She's wrong. And that's not good for you. because she might be wrong about a lot of things, and you might be one of them.
Whoa.
And I really had to take that to heart and think, okay, if my time is spent fighting and defending and protecting and guarding and hoarding and right, I'm not spending the time doing the other things that our Savior taught us to do towards not just everyone, but literally against or with or for people that we married or are in our family.
Yeah.
And so I think for me, the biggest indication that I'm on the wrong track is when I'm confronted with the idea that I've built a really convenient story that gives me a lot of relief from my feelings that, towards someone else. And so, and not to say maybe it's not true. It could be, right? But then you have to decide, is that the right way to think about it? Am I at the conviction place in my belief system, which is based on my values and principles? Or am I just in a really convenient place to tell a story so people feel bad for me? They feel pity for me. So I can be kind of off the hook. Right? So, but we're going to talk about some more things
Yeah.
next time.
Yep. I guess any closing thoughts?
Um, I always come back to curiosity because I think it's a really important, uh, I think it's a really important skill. It ties into a lot of principles as well. Curiosity becomes something where you're mostly trying to understand and find clarity, right? So when someone says something that brings up feelings in your body, asking questions is always great. You hear someone say something that you feel like is confusion oriented in your brain, then ask a question to clarify, like, did you mean that to sound like that? And maybe they did. And that to me, that opens up a whole different set of things to be curious about, like, why would you look at it like that? Huh, what brought this to, right? This belief that you have, like getting to the bottom line. I have a lot of people that I'm friends with that I do not agree with at all. A lot of things, but they're just really honest, open people. And I find that very interesting. I'm really curious about them. Not because I agree at all, but because it it makes they're interesting, right? And so I think curiosity can be a very healthy skill set to focus on right now as you start into the prepare, because as you start to have to take accountability for things that maybe you've done wrong or that you didn't know you did, right? That needs to bolster healing between someone that you're disconnected with. Curiosity helps bridge that pretty quick. When you're like, okay, tell me about that experience for you. And you explain to me how impactful that was. And then obviously that invokes a certain amount of empathy and a desire. Desires the next part of repair. You have to have a desire to have a relationship with that person in order to heal any kind of breaches. And so those are all skills that will come
Yeah.
for the future. So
And I think that's a great, I guess, kind of ending thought because the next time, yeah, we're going to talk kind of about what to do when damage happens, kind of what you really mean by repair and trying to fix those things and such. So I can't wait for the next one. Thanks,
me
Mama.
too. Thank you, sweetheart.